There are far worse things facing man than death.
What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from SBMTG on the YouTube.com. We like magic, and today I've got what I think is a pretty competitive deck for Kaladesh Standard. Let's take a look at Mardu Reanimator. Well, in the few days since I released the top 10 upcoming deck techs video, if you haven't seen it, check it out. I think this is the deck that's probably seen the most reaction. A lot of people really want to see this because it's an easy concept to get behind. You know, you use Cathartic Reunion and Tormenting Voice to dump Gear Hulks into your graveyard, and then you refurbish them. We can also use Ever After in this equation. That allows us to use actual creatures instead of just artifact creatures. So, a lot of good things going about this deck, not to mention that Mardu has good planeswalkers and removal. So let's take a look because the deck comes together really well. It's got a lot of tools. Normally I would start with the creatures and just sort of go by curve from there, but just like the control deck I did a couple of days ago, the Esper control deck, this deck, Reanimator decks in general, are a different kind of deck than your basic deck, and they work differently. So you can't just go, well, these are the creatures and these are the spells. So let's actually go line by line over what makes this Reanimator deck tick, starting with the stuff that dumps stuff in our graveyard. The good thing about those cards in our deck is that they also allow us to see a bunch of cards. Case in point, we're going to play 4 copies of Cathartic Reunion and 3 copies of Tormenting Voice. Now you could switch the copies here, you know, 4 Tormenting Voice, 3 Cathartic Reunion if you wanted, but I really liked Reunion. You know, drawing 3 for just 2 mana is unbelievable, and it does a couple of things for us. It gives us a higher chance of drawing into more Gear Hulks and stuff that we can then pitch on turn 3 with another Reunion or Tormenting Voice, and it gives us a better chance of drawing into another Reunion or Tormenting Voice to cast on turn 3. So it ups the chance of doing both of those things, drawing something else that allows us to pitch cards, or drawing something that we can then pitch. So I'm playing all 4 copies of Cathartic Reunion, but both cards are just obvious. And aside from them, I'm going to play 2 copies of Nahiri the Harbinger, which could be a 3 of in the deck, but because we're playing so many Reunions and Voices, we have a higher chance of drawing into a bunch of cards here. So I think that it allows us to play a couple of fewer copies of certain cards, Nahiri being one of those, especially considering that she sort of clashes with our plan of refurbish on turn 4. So, you know, sometimes Nahiri isn't great because she interrupts the plan of refurbish on turn 4, but she does everything the deck wants to do. You know, she allows us to, for her ultimate, she can bring in any of these Hulks, or even the one Emrakul that we've got lurking in the deck, which is always awesome. And then, by the way, after her ultimate's done, the turn's over, and the thing pops back to your hand, you can then just next turn use her +1, tick her up, and pitch the thing that popped back to your hand, and then refurbish it. Pretty cool trick there. But not only that, she allows you to pitch stuff into your graveyard, good for a Reanimator deck, and she's good removal against a lot of different stuff that's going to be important. So everything about Nahiri is good. Definitely play her. But one of the more important things about a Reanimator deck is what cards we're going to use to reanimate creatures. So let's talk about those. We're going to play the whole 4 of the entire playset of Refurbish here, and we're going to play 2 copies of Ever After as well. We're only playing something like 12 creatures in the deck, and we'll get to those in just a second, so I don't think Ever After is as important, although sometimes it can be just ridiculous blowout. So I'm going to play some number of them. But as far as Refurbish goes, most of those creatures are artifact creatures, and Refurbish serves a dual purpose. Not only can it on turn 4 get a Gear Hulk out of the graveyard that you've pitched on turn 2 or 3, but it can also, if your opponent removes a Gear Hulk, you can always just put it right back into play for 4 mana. That's really good, and we play a pretty good long game strategy in our Reanimator deck. I like the sort of dual purpose of this deck. Not only can we put a huge guy into play on turn 4 and really pressure the opponent, but we can also play a fairly long game if need be and outlast a lot of removal. As stated, 12 creatures in the deck, and a bunch of them are Gear Hulks. Let's talk about those. We're going to play 4 Noxious Gear Hulk, the whole play set of those, 2 Combustible Gear Hulks, and 2 Cataclysmic Gear Hulks. Now, I was playing a 3-3 split of Noxious and Cataclysmic, but Noxious is just so freaking good. Like, he does die to Grasp of Darkness, but that's sort of where the floor on him is. Aside from that, the card is just freaking phenomenal. Like, really like that we put a huge body on the field and get rid of their best body. Just Noxious is insane. Cataclysmic's still pretty good, and I do like that if we have another creature out, that we can keep Cataclysmic and the creature, a different creature. That's really nice. And it's really good with Ever After. You stack the triggers, you know. Like you put a Cataclysmic and a Noxious in play, Cataclysmic's trigger goes off first. You keep the Noxious and the Cataclysmic, and then when the Noxious's trigger goes off, you kill the creature that they left behind. That's really, really nice. And Combustible's good too, just because he's the biggest body that we're playing, and because in this deck we're playing a lot of stuff that cost a lot of mana. So they can either let us draw the 3 cards, which is just, we would love to do that. Drawing 3 is very good. Or if they decide to, you know, mill us, then we put more stuff in the graveyard that we can reanimate later. That's good. And we're pretty liable to do a ton of damage to them in one fell swoop. So, you know, either way, they are screwed, no matter what they do with Combustible Girl. So, and, you know, even if we do get 2 lands and a Tormenting Voice off the mill for Combustible, we still got a big 6/6 body, and you're not going to whiff that badly too often. I'm also going to just play 1 Emrakul the Promised End in this deck. I feel like it's important mostly because we're playing Nahiri and she can just throw him into play. You won't get the cast trigger, no, or her into play, excuse me, but you won't get the cast trigger, but you will have a huge 13/13 flying thing. It's just going to smash through. That's good. You can always then, when she pops back to your hand, pitch her into your graveyard, and then ever after her back into play. Like, why not play Emrakul, especially considering we're playing enough, you know, different card types to get her down to like 7 casting costs. So we can cast her naturally sometimes in long games. Just, I think it's important, but only the 1. And we're going to play 1 copy of Linvala the Preserver, but I'm not quite done with the creatures. I'll tell you about my last choice here in a second. Linvala, though, obviously pretty good against like aggro decks and some mid-range decks that strike relatively fast too. So I just wouldn't be caught dead without Linvala. The card is fantastic, and it's the only thing that we're playing that like flies. So I think that's also important, is to have something we can swing with in the air. And the last creature we're playing, we're going to play a 2 of Pia Nilar, and I put her at the end here because I think she needs the most justification. I had a couple of slots left for creatures. I wanted to play at least 12. I was playing 10. That was way too thin on creatures, and I probably could still play 1 more creature. 13 would be nice. But Pia Nilar does an awful lot for us. Not only is she good in the early game against aggro, which we are relatively weak against aggro and tokens builds, and this lets us go a little bit wider, block the tokens builds, block the aggro builds on turn 3, and let us, you know, a little more hope of getting to turn 4 and 5 where all of our action is. Or, you know, sometimes against aggro, we'll reanimate something on turn 4 with a refurbish, and they're still going to run us over because they have this huge wide board and a Reckless Bushwhacker in their hand. So, you know, sometimes Pia Nilar can be really, really nice to help block for you on turn 3. And also, you know, she will let your Gear Hulks, you know, she'll pump your Gear Hulks for you. And Mana Sink late game is not bad. Send your Gear Hulks through for a few extra damage. But also, that last ability, she can sacrifice her Thopter and take out the best blocker on their side of the field. You know, and that can be real, or the chump blocker on their side of the field. Make them block with the guy that is big, but can still be bested by one of our Hulks in combat. She has so many different uses, and she's not bad with Ever After either. You know, you bring in Pia Nilar and say Linvala, for instance. You know, in that case, there are times you stack the triggers correctly, and you can get Linvala, her Angel, 5 life, and Pia, and her Thopter. It's just suddenly you have this big full board. Same thing with Noxious Gear Hulk. You know, you bring Noxious Gear Hulk and Pia Nilar back with an Ever After, and suddenly you've killed one of their creatures. You have a huge 5/4 body, you have a 2/2 body and a 1/1 flyer, and the ability to pump the Gear Hulk you just put in, or make him a little harder to block. So Pia just serves so many cool functions in this deck that I think she does deserve the 2 of. Whew, that was a lot of explanation for a 3-drop creature, but I should also say this: we don't have a ton of action on turn 3 in this deck. You know, turn 2 we want a Tormenting Voice or a Cathartic Reunion, and then turn 3 we're hoping to do that over again or cast a removal spell. We're fairly thin on turn 3 as far as action goes, and Pia Nilar fills the 3-drop slot hole pretty well too, so there's that. But anyway, let's move on. We're playing 1 more Planeswalker in the deck for a total of 3 in the main. We're going to play 1 Liliana. I'm sorry about that. I was playing 2. So I'm saving you $40 by cutting it 1. But I think Liliana is still important. Not only does she cover the early game if we happen to get her, she covers the early game against aggro pretty well. But obviously her ultimate is game winning if we can just protect her. But the best thing about her in this deck is her ability to sort of play off of our dropping stuff from the graveyard theme. You know, we can drop stuff in the graveyard, and if we don't have a refurbish or an Ever After, we can use her second ability to just put it back in our hand and play it again. And we're dropping a bunch of creatures in the yard, so something like her second ability is very, very good. Sort of a mini refurbish some of the time. So really like Liliana, again, covers a lot of bases, just like Pia. And we're playing 7 main deck removal spells to finish off the deck here. We're going to start with 2 copies of Declaration in Stone. Most of our action on turn 2 is going to be in Cathartic Reunion, Tormenting Voice, obviously. But I still like to have this as an option, not only late game against tokens builds and stuff, that's always a good option to have a declaration, but also against aggro decks, just so we have an option on turn 2 to slow them down, which we'll have to do sometimes. So definitely a couple of copies of declaration. Now, as far as the rest of the removal, I'm going to go ahead and show it to you. This is 2 copies of Ruinous Path, 1 copy of Unlicensed Disintegration, and 2 copies of Radiant Flames. Now, I was playing a copy of Anguished Unmaking here, but I have moved it to the board. You could always play it instead of Disintegration, but I do like Disintegration. You know, if you have a Gearhulk in play, sometimes you can kill one of their guys, hit them for 3, and then swing free with a Gearhulk because you just destroy their blocker. That does happen sometimes and can lead to these huge damage swings. So Disintegration is not bad at all, but if you think you're going to be facing more Planeswalkers, you know, in game 1 at your LGS, then I would say Anguished Unmaking is probably the better choice. So keep that in mind. But Ruinous Path, important, good against both creatures and Planeswalkers, covers that base. And then Radiant Flames is quietly one of the most important cards in the deck. We suffer against aggro because we don't have any action on turn 1, and we're not doing anything on turn 2 to advance our board. Same thing with turn 3 unless we play a Pia. We're just not really doing much in the first 3 turns. So aggro can be a huge issue because we just let them get a good start against us. We're goldfishing for the first 3 turns of the game. Radiant Flames, though, can really help us out against aggro. Radiant Flames incredibly important on turn 3, and we've got another one in the sideboard because it's just that important. Don't sleep on Radiant Flame. You gotta play it in this deck, is all I'm saying. 25 lands in the deck, and it's pretty much as expected, but I do want to point out Gaia Reach Sanitarium, which gives you a way to discard things, and draw cards, by the way, if you don't have, say, a Tormenting Voice or Cathartic Reunion late game. So Gaia Reach Sanitarium is in, and also Drownyard Temple, which we can discard and then put back into play. Not too shabby. So pretty much everything's as expected, but I would at least play those 2 lands in the deck. Now here's a very important sideboard. We're basically boarding into Mardu control, you know, and I want to play like Deadweight or Galvanic Bombardment or something against aggro in here, but we are boarding into another copy of Radiant Flames, 2 copies of Fumigate. We do have plenty of tricks against aggro. Not only that, but Kaladesh is in the sideboard against aggro as well, so I don't know that we have to devote all the slots to Deadweight or Galvanic Bombardment, but worthy of note, if you're playing against a lot of aggro in your LGS, that those are 2 cards that you might want to consider. Mostly we're boarding into a sort of mid-ranger control-y sort of shell. We're playing more Planeswalkers on the board here, you know. If you just want to abandon, especially against things like aggro, you know, if you just want to abandon the Reanimator theme, you know, then you can do that in the sideboard. We've got tricks against, you know, not only aggro, but bigger decks, you know, things that want to play like Deep Fiend and Emrakul and stuff. We've got Transgress the Mind against those. We've got Gideon as a very good mid-game piece and very good against other control decks. That's not bad at all. So a lot of good options here, and I probably should bring up Torch of Defiance because she's not in the main deck. I already don't want to play a bunch of copies of Nahiri because she costs 4, Refurbish costs 4. I don't want our plans to conflict too much on turn 4, so Torch of Defiance amazingly didn't make the main deck, but she will in a lot of decks. I'm not saying she's bad, just Nahiri is more tailored to this deck's purpose. But if we're boarding into a control deck, obviously Chandra's pretty good, you know. Not only can she destroy creatures and sort of have a pseudo card advantage, which is very good in the mid-game. But also, she ramps, which is not bad. You can play turn 4 Chandra into turn 5 Combustible Gearhulk or something, or Noxious Gearhulk if you have the mana for it on turn 5 after turn 4 Chandra, and that's good. But again, I just thought she conflicted too much. She made our, you know, our 4 drops a little too much. So I've relegated her to the board. But again, if we board into control, we have a good matchup against some decks, namely aggro, and in some cases, other control decks. But we perform fairly well against control game 1 because we have so many ways of bringing creatures back. And here are your power rankings right here. Final score of 69, which is a pretty competitive score. Anybody that's been following the channel knows that anything approaching 70 is usually pretty good. And this deck scores well on my scale, at least. You know, we don't do anything poorly, although we are middling in some categories. You know, we're not extremely versatile until game 2 when we board. We're not incredibly fast, but we do have some speed. We're not incredibly offensive, but our creatures are big, you know? So we're sort of middling in a lot of categories here, but it adds up to a very, very good score. And I think that the deck can back up that score with action, you know? Not only can we be fast against some decks, you know, turn 4 Refurbish a Gearhulk can always be, that's a very good play and usually applies a lot of pressure. Or or we can play a more long game strategy against control decks and just sort of make sure that no matter if they remove stuff, we always have a way to bring it back, which can be a problem against things that exile, transgress the mind, anguish unmaking, declaration in stone. There's a lot of that in the format. But for the most part, we will have good long game against control. Now here's the bad news. Honestly, this is one of the more expensive decks that I've done in a while. The main deck is going to cost $225, when I was playing two Lilianas, it was way more than that. But $225 for the main and $175 for that sideboard, mostly because of all the planeswalkers. Chandra, Torch of Defiance is ridiculously expensive right now. What have I got her at? $43 on TCG Player, which means she's twice as much on Star City. Usually is how that works. So Chandra is incredibly expensive right now. And she's the main culprit in the board. But there's also Gideon's, Kaladesh, and there's a lot of expensive stuff. So, most expensive board I've made in a while. Although you could switch it up. You could play Deadweight, Galvanic Bombardment. There's a couple of things you can play the board. What is it? Fragmentize, I think it's called. You can play that because we don't have much protection against artifacts or enchantments outside of Nahiri. So that might be good to play in the board if you want to save a couple of bucks, And you can save dollars here and there in this deck, If you don't want to play Liliana, you don't necessarily have to. I've seen versions of this deck that play like Corrupted Graphstone at a couple of copies, and that might not be bad. Helps your ramp as an artifact. So, it's maybe not bad. But right now I think this is the most competitive version of the deck that I could put together. Problem with that is obviously it's going to cost you a couple of bucks, and I apologize for that, but this is what I think may be one of the good decks in the format. I'm not quite sure that it's going to be one of the tier 1 top 8 decks, but it is a blast to play, and it's got an awful lot of power in it, and it can take games by surprise sometimes, or it can just be really fast in accomplishing its goal. So a lot of good things about this deck, and I do think that it does a lot of things very well. That's all for this one. I hope you enjoyed Mardu Reanimator. How would you fix the deck? How would you change the deck? What did you not like about what I included? All of these things. I always got to ask him, what are we doing next time? Always got to ask that question too. Next time, I'm going to do a budget deck. I want to do, competitive budget. But I'm not sure which one I'm going to do, so you help me decide here. It's either going to be $20 Moby Dick, $20 Blue Whale. I called it in the upcoming deck text video. It's basically a mono blue energy deck that seeks to play a bunch of small creatures in the early game. Then you play Aether Squall Ancient, pick up all your small creatures, play them again, and then you'll always have the energy needed to bounce everything with Aether Squall Ancient. That way you can lock the opponent out. Seems like a fun deck. Or, instead of the $20 deck, I could do a $50 budget deck, and that'll be Cheerios, one of the most talked about combo decks in the upcoming standard. Basically, it's you play a bunch of zero casting cost artifacts like Endless One and stuff, and then you play Paradoxical Outcome, returning them all to your hand, drawing a bunch of cards, playing them over again, and basically you're getting triggers off of Aetherflux Reservoir the entire time. So eventually you'll get to 50 life before you know it. That usually happens on turn 5. So which of these decks do you want to see? The wonky $20 weirdo combo deck that wins sometimes, a lot of the time. I'm surprised by that deck's performance. Or do you want to see the $50 wonky combo deck that is like legitimately wonkier? That's all I've got for right now, though, guys. If you enjoyed the content, hit the like button. It helps me out more than anything you can do. You can also share the video because that helps, or you can sub so you can get all the crazy deck techs coming up, because it is deck tech season, my favorite time of the year. So I'll see you guys later. I'm Dev from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.